station, the one thing I want most in the whole world at this moment. And what's more, I needn't go through the town to get to it, and I shan't have to support this humiliating character by repartees which, though thoroughly effective, do not assist one's sense of self-respect. He made his way to the station accordingly, consulted a timetable, and found that a train bound more or less in the direction of his home was due to start in half an hour. "More luck," said the Toad, his spirits rising rapidly, and he went off to the booking office to buy a ticket. He gave the name of the station that he knew to be nearest to Toad Hall, and mechanically put his fingers in search of the necessary money in his waistcoat pocket. But here the cotton gown which had nobly stood by him so far intervened and frustrated his efforts. He just couldn't get through it. The other travellers waited with impatience. They had tickets to buy, trains to catch, luggage to collect, and aunts and uncles to say goodbye to. And here was this stupid old washerwoman holding them all up. At last he got through the gown, and then horror! Not only no money, but no pocket, not even a waistcoat. And then he remembered that he'd left both coat and waistcoat behind him in his cell, and with them his pocketbook, money, keys, watch, matches, pencil case, all that makes life worth living. In his misery, he made one desperate effort to carry the thing off. Becoming Mr. Toad once more, he said, "Oh, look here, I find I've left my purse behind. Oh, just give me that ticket, will you, and I'll send the money on tomorrow. I'm well known in these parts." The clerk stared at him for a moment, and then laughingly said, "I should think you were pretty well known in these parts, if you've tried this game on often. Now stand away from the window, please, madam. You're obstructing the other passengers." Baffled and full of despair, Toad wandered blindly down the platform with tears trickling down each side of his nose. It was hard, he thought, to be within sight of safety and almost of home, and to be balked by the want of a few wretched shillings, and by the mistrustfulness of paid officials. Very soon his escape would be discovered, he thought. He'd be caught, reviled, loaded with chains, dragged back again to prison, and bread and water and straw. His guards and penalties would be doubled, and oh, what sarcastic remarks the girl would make. What was to be done? Could he not squeeze under the seat of a carriage, he thought. He'd seen this done often by schoolboys who'd found a better use for their ticket money. And as he pondered, he found himself opposite the engine, which was being oiled, wiped, and generally caressed by its affectionate driver, a burly man with an oil can in one hand and a lump of cotton waste in the other. "Well, hello, mother," said the driver. "And what's your trouble? You don't look very cheerful." "Oh, sir," cried Toad, "I am a poor and unhappy washerwoman, and I've lost all my money and can't pay for a ticket, and I must get home tonight somehow. The children will be hungry and upsetting and breaking things, and oh dear, oh dear." "Well, bless my soul, we can't have that, can we?" said the kindly engine driver. "I'll tell you what. You're a washerwoman and I'm an engine driver, as you may well see, and there's no denying it's terribly dirty work. You wash me a few shirts and send them on when you get home, and though it's against regulations, I'll give you a ride on my engine." The Toad's misery turned into rapture as he eagerly scrambled up into the cab of the engine. Of course, he'd never washed a shirt in his life, and had no intention of beginning now, but he thought, when I get safely home and have money again, I'll make it up to the engine driver. The guard waved his flag, the engine driver whistled in cheerful response, and the train moved out of the station. As the speed increased, the Toad could see on either side of him real fields and trees and hedges and cows and horses, all flying past him. And he thought how every minute was bringing him nearer to Toad Hall, and sympathetic friends, and a soft bed to sleep in, and good things to eat, and praise and admiration at the recital of his adventures and his surpassing cleverness. And then he began to skip up and down, and shout, and sing snatches of song, to the great astonishment of the engine driver, who'd come across washerwomen before, but never one at all like this. By the time it was dark, they'd covered many and many a mile, and the train raced through moonlit countryside. And then Toad noticed that the engine driver, with a puzzled expression on his face, was leaning over the side of the engine and listening hard. "That's very strange," he said to Toad. "We're the last train running in this direction tonight, and yet I swear there's another one following us." Toad ceased his frivolous antics at once. He sank slowly down onto the floor, grave and depressed, trying desperately not to think of the awful possibilities. "I can see it clearly now," the engine driver called out. "It is an engine on our rails and coming along at a great pace. And it's crowded with the queerest lot of people I ever did see." Indeed, it was a most amazing sight. A single engine pouring forth smoke and steam, and clinging to it all manner of men caught up in the chase. Ancient warders waving cudgels, policemen in their helmets waving truncheons, shabbily dressed men, unmistakably detectives in their pot hats, waving revolvers and walking sticks, and all of them shouting the same thing: "Stop! Stop! Stop!" The Toad, now kneeling, raised his paws in supplication. "Save me! Oh, save me, dear, kind Mr. Engine Driver, and I will confess everything. I am not the simple washerwoman I seem to be. I have no children waiting for me. I am a Toad, the well-known and popular Mr. Toad. I have just escaped, by great daring and cleverness, from a loathsome dungeon into which my enemies had flung me, and if I am recaptured, then chains, bread and water, and misery for me once more. Oh, unhappy and innocent Toad." The engine driver looked down on him very sternly and said, "Now then, tell the truth. What were you put in prison for?" "Oh, it was nothing very much," said poor Toad, colouring deeply. "I only borrowed a motor car while the owners were at lunch. They had no need of it at the time. But people, especially judges, take such harsh views of thoughtlessness and high-spirited action." The engine driver looked grave and said, "I fear that you have indeed been a wicked Toad, and by rights I ought to give you up. But you're obviously in trouble and distress, so I won't desert you. I don't hold with motor cars for one thing, and I don't hold for being ordered about by policemen when I'm on my own engine for another. And the sight of an animal in tears always makes me soft-hearted. So cheer up, Toad, we may beat 'em yet." They piled on more coals, shoveling furiously. The furnace roared, the sparks flew, and the engine leapt and swung, but still their pursuers slowly gained. "I'm afraid it's no good, Toad," said the engine driver as the train ran into a long tunnel. "There's just one thing left for us to do, and it's your only chance, so listen carefully. On the other side of the tunnel is a thick wood. Now, we're going flat out, but the others are bound to slow down a bit in the tunnel for fear of an accident. So when we're through, I'll shut off steam and brake as hard as I can, and you must leap for the safety of the woods. Then I'll go off again, and they can chase me if they like, for as long as they like. Now, be ready." They piled on more coals as the engine rushed and roared and rattled through the darkness, till at last they shot out at the other end into the moonlight and saw the wood lying dark and helpful on either side of the line. The driver shut off steam, slammed on the brakes, and when the train was almost at a walking pace, he called out, "Jump!" Toad rolled and twisted and bumped and fell all the way down the steep embankment. He collided with hillocks, knocked over bushes, and scared the local residents right out of their tiny wits. At last, he reached the bottom and dived into the wood. By this time, his train had disappeared into the night, but suddenly, out of the tunnel burst the pursuing engine, roaring and whistling, her motley crew waving their various weapons and shouting, "Stop! Stop!" And seeing this incredible sight, the Toad, for the first time since he was thrown into prison, laughed. He laughed and laughed and laughed, till the tears were streaming down his cheeks and his sides ached. And then he stopped laughing. In fact, not only did he stop, but he wondered why he'd even started laughing in the first place. For here he was in an unknown wood. It was very late and dark and cold, and he was without money, supper, or friends. He found the silent wood strange and unfriendly. An owl swooped noiselessly towards him, brushing his shoulder and making him jump. So he sought the shelter of a hollow tree, and, tired, hungry, and humiliated, made himself as comfortable as possible, and went to sleep. There is no doubt that soft earth and a warm covering of leaves do make a far more comfortable bed than the straw and cold stone floor of a prison cell. And that was why the toad slept so well that night in the hollow of the old tree. What woke him was partly the bright sunlight streaming in on him, and partly the exceeding coldness of his toes, which was not surprising, since the size of the hollow dictated that one end of Toad had to protrude outside the tree, and he'd reasoned that if something had to be chilled, then better his toes than his head. He sat up, rubbing his eyes first and his complaining toes next, and wondered for a moment where he was. He looked for the familiar stone wall and little barred window of his prison, and then his heart leapt as he remembered everything that had happened the previous day, and that above all he was free. Free! The thought and the word alone were worth 50 blankets. He was warm from end to end as he leapt into the jolly world outside the hollow. The morning sun flooded the wood, dispelling all the nervous terrors of yesterday, and Toad set off on his way in the happiest of spirits. He had all the world to himself that early summer morning, but the woods and fields, even the road itself when he reached it, seemed lonely, and Toad needed desperately to find someone who'd say which way that lonely road was pointing. Not knowing which direction, if any, led to safety, the Toad decided to head for a small canal a short distance ahead. It ambled along side by side with the road for many a mile. But, like the road, the canal was also unwilling to talk to strangers about its destination. Then, round the bend came plodding a solitary horse, stooping forward in anxious thought. From rope traces attached to his collar stretched a long line that led, dripping, down into the water. Toad let the horse pass and stood waiting for what the fates were sending him. With a pleasant swirl of quiet water at its blunt bow, the barge slid up alongside of him, its gaily painted gunwale level with the towing path. Its sole occupant, a big, stout woman, wearing a linen sunbonnet, one brawny arm laying along the tiller. "A nice morning, ma'am," she remarked to Toad as she drew level with him. "I dare say it is," responded Toad politely, as he walked along the towpath abreast of her. "I dare say it is a nice morning to them that's not in sore trouble as I am. But here's me married daughter sends off to me to come post-haste, so I come at once fearing the worst, and I've left my washing business and the kids to look after themselves. And on top of that, I've lost my money in my way, and I dread to think what's happened to my daughter." "Well, where might your married daughter be living, ma'am?" asked the bargewoman. She lives close to a fine house called Toad Hall, which is on the river somewhere in these parts. Of Toad Hall? Why, I'm going that way myself, replied the bargewoman. This canal joins the river not far from Toad Hall. You come along with me, I'll give you a lift. Soon they were gliding down the little canal, Toad perched on the side of the barge in a manner most unbecoming even to a washerwoman. Ha, Toad's luck again, thought he. I always come out on top. So you're in the washing business, ma'am, said the bargewoman, and a very good business you've got, no doubt. Finest business in the whole country, said Toad airily. All the gentry come to me, wouldn't go to anyone else if they were paid. They know me so well. You see, I personally supervise all that's done on the premises. Washing, ironing, starching, making up gents' fine shirts for evening wear. Everything's done under my own eyes. Are you fond of washing? Asked the bargewoman thoughtfully. I love it, said Toad. I simply dote on it. Never so happy as when I've got both arms in the washtub. What a regular piece of good fortune, for both of us, then, that we met, exclaimed the bargewoman. Oh, why do you say that? Asked the Toad, nervously. Well, look at me, replied the bargewoman. I like washing too, like yourself, and I have to do my own moving about as I do. But my husband, why, right now he should be attending the barge, but he's gone off with a dog to see if they can pick up a rabbit for supper. So how am I to get on with the washing? Oh, never mind about the washing, said Toad, not liking the subject at all. Try and fix your mind on that rabbit. A nice fat one, I'll be bound. Got any onions? I can't fix me mind on anything but my washing, said the bargewoman. Look, there's a heap of things in my cabin, and as you love washing, if you'll just take one or two of the most necessary, I won't venture to describe them to a lady like you, but you'll recognize them and put them through the wash tub as we go along. It'll be a real help to me. You'll find everything you want below. Toad was now fairly cornered. He looked for escape this way and that, saw that he was too far from the bank for a flying leap, and sullenly resigned himself to his fate. If it comes to that, he thought in desperation, I suppose any fool can wash. And so Toad stood before the washtub. In one hand, the necessaries selected at random from the bargewoman's cabin. In the other, a large bar of soap. And as he stood, he desperately tried to recollect what he'd seen in casual glances through laundry windows. A long half-hour passed, and every minute of it saw Toad getting crosser and crosser. Nothing that he could do to the garments seemed to please them or do them good. He tried coaxing, he tried slapping, he tried punching, but they smiled back at him out of the tub, as happy and unwashed as ever. Once or twice he looked nervously over his shoulder at the bargewoman, but she appeared to be gazing out in front of her, absorbed in her steering. His back ached badly, and he noticed with dismay that his paws were beginning to get all crinkly. Now, Toad was very proud of his paws. He muttered under his breath words that should never pass the lips of either washerwomen or toads, and lost the soap for the 50th time. And even as he was muttering, a large, strong hand fell on his shoulder. Well, 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 said the bargewoman. I've been watching you all the time. I thought you must be humbug all along from the conceited way you talked. Pretty washerwoman you are. Never washed even a dishcloth in your whole life, I'll lay. Toad's temper, which had been simmering viciously for some time, now fairly boiled over, and he lost all control of himself. You common, low, fat bargewoman, he shouted. Washerwoman indeed. I would have you know that I am a toad, a very well-known, respected, and distinguished toad. I may be under a bit of a cloud at present, but I will not be laughed at by a bargewoman. The woman moved nearer to him and peered under his bonnet. Well, I never, she cried. "You are a toad, a horrid, nasty, crawly toad, and in my nice clean barge too. Now that's one thing I will not have." One big brawny arm shot out and caught Toad by a foreleg, while the other gripped him fast by a hind leg. "Going to see a married daughter, indeed. Left the children to look after themselves, have you? Ha! I'll give you, poor old washerwoman." Poor Toad. He was now quite speechless with rage as the barge woman carried him onto the deck and hurled him over the side. The world turned suddenly upside down. He saw a blur of barge and water, of trees and grass, and he saw the astonished look on the faces of two cows by the water's edge, who never, in their long contented lives, had seen such an incredible sight. The water, when he eventually reached it, proved quite cold enough for his taste, though its chill was not sufficient to quell his proud spirit or slake the heat of his fiery temper. He rose to the surface, spluttering, and when he'd wiped the duckweed out of his eyes, the first thing he saw was the fat barge woman looking back at him over the stern of the retreating barge and laughing. It took Toad a very long time to get to the shore, for the cotton gown greatly impeded his efforts and was immensely tiring. But when he'd regained some of his strength, he gathered his wet skirt well over his arms and ran after the barge as fast as his legs would carry him. He was wild with indignation and thirsting for revenge. The barge woman was still laughing when he drew level with her. "Put yourself through a mango washer, woman," she called out, "and iron your face, and you'll pass for quite a decent-looking toad." Toad never paused for a reply. He saw what he wanted ahead of him. Running swiftly on, he overtook the horse, unfastened the tow rope, and cast off. The barge woman's laughter turned to rage as she saw Toad jump onto the horse's back and urge it to a gallop in the direction of the open country. The wind whistled around him as he sped on. And at last, feeling that both he and the horse could do with a breather, he pulled his steed to a halt on a small hillock, and he looked back over the way he'd come. There in the distance he could see the small canal, and then he chuckled to himself, for the barge was also visible. It was hard aground on the bank, and on top he could see a small figure leaping up and down in fury. And Toad's chuckle became a laugh, a mighty laugh, a laugh infectious enough to humor even a horse. And so the horse laughed with him, but it was a long time since he had heard or seen anything funny. They sat on the hill and laughed. They laughed and laughed and laughed. Perhaps Toad would not have laughed so heartily had he known that ahead of him lay more hair-raising adventures and an unexpected meeting with an old friend. Never in his whole life had Toad laughed so much as at the sight of the canal barge stuck fast and the barge woman jumping up and down in fury. Well, serve her right, he said to himself, thinking of how she'd thrown him into the water. And he looked over at the horse, who was spread-eagled on the ground, for he too had found it very funny and seemed not at all bothered about getting back to his dreary job of pulling the barge along the towpath, which was, after all, understandable. At long last, both creatures staggered to their feet, and set off at a very slow pace across the country. They'd travelled some miles and were feeling drowsy in the warm sunshine when they came to a wide common. Nearby was a dingy gypsy caravan, and beside it a man was sitting on a bucket. He was busy, smoking and staring into the wide world. A fire of sticks was burning nearby, and over the fire hung an iron pot, from which came forth bubblings and gurglings and a vague, suggestive steaminess. Also, smells. Warm, rich, and varied smells that twined and twisted and wreathed themselves at last into one complete, voluptuous, and perfect smell. Now Toad was very, very hungry. He looked the gypsy over carefully, and the gypsy puffed on his pipe and looked at Toad. The gypsy spoke first. "Want to sell that horse of yours?" he said. "What?" cried Toad. "Me sell this beautiful horse? Who'd take the washing to my customers every week? And anyway, I'm very fond of him. Oh, no, I'd never sell him. But all the same, just out of interest, of course, how much would you offer me?" The gypsy looked the horse over, then looked Toad over with equal care. "A shilling a leg," he said briefly, and went on smoking his pipe. "A shilling a leg?" said Toad indignantly. "Oh, well, just wait a minute. I'll have to work that out." Toad climbed down off the horse and sat beside the fire. He did vast sums and calculations on his arms and his legs and muttered figures to himself, and at last said, "A shilling a leg? Why, that comes to exactly 4 shillings. I wouldn't accept a paltry 4 shillings for such a horse." "Well then," said the gypsy, "I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's me last word." Toad pondered for a while, for he was hungry and quite penniless. "Oh, look here, gypsy," he said at last, "and this is my last word, 6 and 6pence in cash, and as much breakfast as I can eat at one sitting, and you can have horse, harness, and all." The gypsy grumbled frightfully about how such deals would lead to his ruination, as he carefully counted out 6 shillings and 6pence from a dirty canvas bag, and placed them on Toad's outstretched paw. Then he went over to the fire and poured from the iron pot a glorious stream of hot, rich stew. It was indeed the most beautiful stew in the world, being made of partridges and pheasants and chickens and hares and rabbits and peahens and guinea fowls and 1 or 2 other things. Toad took the plate on his lap, almost crying, and stuffed and stuffed and stuffed. He thought he'd never eaten so good a breakfast in all his life. An hour later, on his travels once more, he was a very different Toad. And as he walked, he wondered at his ability always to find a way out of trouble, and his pride and conceit began to swell within him. "Ho, ho, ho, what a clever Toad I am! Surely I have no equal. My enemies lock me up, and I escape by sheer ability, coupled with courage. They chase me, and I elude them. I'm thrown into a canal by an evil woman, but I ride off in triumph on her horse." And so puffed up did he become, that he made up a poem about himself, which he recited at the top of his voice. It was the most conceited poem you ever heard. "The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared to that of Toad. The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Was it the king or Kitchener? No, it was Mr. Toad. The Queen and her ladies-in-waiting sat at the window and sewed. She cried, 'Look, who's that handsome man?' They answered, 'Mr. Toad.'" There were many more such verses, but far too dreadful to be repeated. Those were some of the milder ones. After many miles of country lanes, he eventually reached the high road, and as he looked down the length of it, he saw a speck in the distance. A speck that turned into a blob that turned into something very familiar, as was the sound that fell upon his ears. "This is something like," said the excited Toad. "I will hail my brothers of the wheel, pitch 'em a bit of a yarn, and they'll give me a lift. Might even be driven up to Toad Hall. That'll be one in the eye for Badger." But then, as he stood at the roadside, he turned pale. His heart turned to water. His knees shook, and he collapsed on the ground. And well he might, for the approaching car was the very one he'd stolen from the inn yard on that fatal day when all his troubles began. And the passengers were the very same people who'd seen him steal it. He sank down onto the road, a shabby, miserable, despairing heap. The terrible motor car stopped just short of him. He heard footsteps coming towards him, and then a voice said, "Oh dear, how sad. This poor old washerwoman seems to have fainted in the road, probably overcome by the heat or perhaps lack of food. Let's take her to the nearest village where she doubtless has friends." And very soon Toad, in luck yet again, was resting on soft cushions as the car proceeded along the high road. And slowly his courage began to revive. "The fresh air's obviously doing her good," said one of the gentlemen. "She's better already." "Oh, thank you kindly, sir," said Toad in a feeble voice. "Yes, I'm feeling a lot better, and I was thinking, might I sit there on the front seat beside the driver? The fresh air full in my face will soon make me right again." "How very sensible," said the gentleman. "Oh, of course you may sit here." So Toad was helped into the front seat beside the driver. And then he felt the old tremors and yearnings and cravings rise within him. "Ah, it's fate," he said to himself. "So why strive? Why struggle?" He turned to the driver at his side and asked, "Please, sir, I've been watching you carefully, and the driving appears to be so easy and interesting. And I'd love to tell my friends that once I drove a motor car and—" "Bravo, ma'am!" said the driver. "I like your spirit. Yes, you have a try." And so the car stopped, and Toad was allowed to take the driver's seat and patiently listen to all the instructions he was given, until at last, slowly and carefully, he set the car in motion. From the back of the car, Toad heard the gentleman comment on his driving. "How well she does it. And it's the first time. Now, who'd have thought it from a washerwoman of all people?" And that did it. "Washerwoman?" thought Toad. "I'll show 'em." The car leapt down the road. The passengers were thrown back in the seats, and Toad drove on at full speed. "Washerwoman indeed!" he shouted breathlessly. "Ho, ho, ho! I am the Toad, the motor-car snatcher, the prison breaker, the Toad who always escapes. Sit still, and in my hands you shall know what driving really is." Recognizing him now, the whole party flung themselves upon Toad. "Seize him!" they cried. "Bind him, chain him, drag him to the nearest police station. Down with the desperate and dangerous Toad!" Alas, they should have remembered to stop the motor car before taking such drastic action. With a half-turn of the wheel, Toad sent the motor car crashing through the low hedge that ran alongside the road. One mighty bound, a violent shock, and the car was in the middle of a duck pond. Toad, for the second time that day, found himself flying. It seemed to go on forever, and he was wondering if he'd developed wings and turned into a toad bird, when, with a thump, he landed in the soft, rich grass of a meadow. There was no time to collect his wits or his breath, for he could see already the angry figures emerging from the pond and making in his direction. And so he ran as fast as he could across the countryside. He slipped, and he fell, and he tripped. He became caught in brambles, and slowly but surely his pursuers gained ground. He struggled on blindly and wildly, and then the earth failed under his feet, and he vainly grasped at the air, and then he found himself head over ears in deep water. Rapid water, water that bore him along with a force he could not contend with. "Oh, my," gasped poor Toad, "if I ever steal another motor car again." And then he saw a branch above his head. He grabbed it and held on, and slowly regained his breath. And as he hung, suspended in the water, he noticed a dark hole beside him in the bank. And something bright and small seemed to twinkle down in the heart of it. And then around it appeared a face. A brown little face with whiskers, with neat ears and silky hair. It was the water rat. So at last, Toad had arrived back on the river bank. But he'd yet to hear what had happened in his absence, and above all, of the terrible goings-on at Toad Hall. The rat gripped the Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck and pulled and pulled and pulled. Inch by inch, the waterlogged Toad was hoisted over the edge of the hole. He was exhausted and numb with cold, but so relieved that he was back on the river bank. He stood in the hall, streaked with mud and weed, with the water streaming off him. "Oh, Ratty!" he cried. "I've been through such time since I last saw you. You can't think. Oh, such trials, such sufferings, and all so nobly borne. I've been in prison, and out of it, of course, been thrown in a canal, stole a horse, which I sold for a small fortune, humbugged everybody, and made 'em do just what I wanted. Toad," said the water rat, "go upstairs at once. Take off those old cotton rags and clean yourself thoroughly. Then put on some of my clothes and try and come down looking like a gentleman, if you can. Now stop swaggering and be off. I've something to say to you later." And catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror, Toad realized just what a sight he was. He humbly set off up the stairs to change. By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table. Both the animals tucked in, and between mouthfuls, Toad told of all his adventures, and the rat listened patiently. When, at last, the Toad had finished both food and story, there was silence for a while. Then the rat spoke. "Toady, I don't want to upset your feelings after all you've been through, but seriously, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? On your own admission, you've been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified out of your life, and insulted. Now, where's the fun in all that? All because you had to go and steal a motor car. Why don't you try and be sensible for a change? Do you think it's any pleasure to me, for instance, to hear other animals saying that I'm the chap that keeps company with jailbirds?" The Toad was silent for a minute. Then he looked the rat straight in the eye. "Ratty, I'm sorry," he said. You're quite right. You always are. No, I will change for the better. I promise you. Now, why don't we have a stroll along the river bank and have a quiet chat? Then I'll go on to Toad Hall and set things going again on the old lines." The Toad was already outside the door when the rat called out, "Did you say stroll gently down to Toad Hall? Do you mean to say that you haven't heard, Toad?" "Heard what?" said Toad, turning in his tracks. "What haven't I heard?" "The Stoats and the Weasels!" cried Rat. "They've taken Toad Hall." "What?" cried the Toad. The Wild Wooders? Oh, you can't mean it, Rat. Taken Toad Hall?" But the Rat did mean it, and walking Toad along the river bank, he explained what had happened. When the news came through that he'd gone to prison for stealing a car, it became the scandal of the whole area, including the Wild Wood. And the Rat told of how the river folk had stood up for Toad and claimed there was no justice in the land and that he should be released immediately, while the Wild Wooders said hard and vicious things like, "It serves him right," and "He's done for this time," and "He'll never get out of prison, ever." "That's the sort of beasts they are," said the Rat. But Mole and Badger, they stuck out that you'd be back, and soon. They didn't know how, but somehow. And then, the most painful part of the story. Apparently, Mole and Badger moved into Toad Hall to keep it ready for its owner's return. But one dark night, a very dark night, and blowing hard, with the rain pouring down, a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage drive to the front entrance. Simultaneously, a body of desperate ferrets, advancing through the kitchen garden, took the backyard and offices, while a company of skirmishing stoats, who stuck at nothing, occupied the conservatory and billiard room, and held the French windows opening onto the lawn. The Mole and the Badger were quite unsuspecting when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in on them from every side. They fought as best they could. But what were 2 against 200? They were beaten severely with sticks and turned out into the cold and the wet. "And the Wild Wooders have been living in the hall ever since," continued the Rat. "The place is in a filthy mess, and they're telling everyone that they're staying for good." "Oh, are they?" said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. "I'll soon see about that." And despite all the Rat could do, he was off. He marched rapidly in the direction of Toad Hall, muttering to himself in his anger, and determined to show the Wild Wooders that not only was Toad back, but that he'd take possession again of his home there and then. He strode up to the imposing front gates of the hall, when suddenly there popped up from behind the palings a long yellow ferret with a gun. "Who goes there?" said the ferret sharply. "Oh, stuff and nonsense!" said Toad very angrily. "What do you mean, talking like that to me? Come out of it at once, or I'll—" The Toad fled for his life, as not just one but several bullets whistled over his head, and he could hear the ferret laughing, and then others joining in. Crestfallen, he rejoined the Water Rat and told him what had happened. "I tried to stop you," said the Rat. "It's no good. They've got sentries posted. They're all armed. You must just wait." But Toad was not inclined to give in all at once. He got out Rat's boat and set off up the river to where the garden of Toad Hall came down to the waterside. Arriving within sight of his old home, he rested on his oars and surveyed the land cautiously. He could see the whole front of Toad Hall glowing in the evening sunshine, the pigeons settling by 2s and 3s along the line of the roof, the garden a blaze of flowers. All seemed tranquil and apparently waiting for his return. He'd try the boathouse first, he thought. So very warily he paddled up to the mouth of the creek and was just passing under the bridge when the great stone completely smashed the boat, and Toad found himself struggling in deep water. Above him, 2 stoats were leaning on the parapet and watching with great glee. "It'll be your head next time, Toady," they called out to him, and the Toad spluttered and fumed and spluttered. It was quite late that same evening. The Toad was silent and depressed. He'd ruined the Rat's suit, cost him a good boat, and it seemed that he'd never live at Toad Hall again. "Oh, cheer up, Toady," said the rat. "Wait till we've seen Mole and Badger and heard their latest news." "Good heavens!" cried Toad, brightening up. "Mole and Badger! Quite forgotten 'em. What's become of the dear fellas?" "Well, may you ask," said the rat reproachfully. "While you've been cavorting all over the countryside, those two poor devoted animals have been living very rough by day and lying very hard by night, watching over your house. Their only thought has been to get back for you your property. You don't deserve such friends." At that moment there was a heavy knock on the door. The Toad, after his experiences that afternoon, was nervous, but the rat walked over and lifted the catch. And who should walk in but Mr. Badger? His shoes were covered in mud, and he looked rough and disheveled. He had all the appearance of someone who hadn't been home for a very long time. He shook Toad by the paw. "Welcome home, Toad," he said. "Oh, but what am I saying? This is a poor homecoming indeed. Unhappy Toad." Then, turning his back on both the animals, he sat down at the table and helped himself to a large slice of ham. Toad looked very worried at this short and serious greeting, but the rat whispered, "Never mind. He's always like that when he's in need of food. Wait till he's eaten. He'll be quite a different animal." And then another knock at the door. A lighter knock. This time Toad opened it, and there stood the Mole. "Hooray!" he cried. "Here's old Toad. Fancy having you back again." The Mole, shabby and unwashed, had forgotten his own discomfort at once. "Never dreamt you'd turn up so soon, Toad," he said. "Now we can really plan to outwit the Wild Wooders." And sitting around the table, they got down to the subject of recapturing Toad Hall, and how they went on. They planned and schemed, agreed and disagreed, laughed and argued, and got precisely nowhere. "I think we should—" "No, we shouldn't," shouted the Toad. "What we ought—" "Don't be so daft, Toady," said the rat. "Well, it was a better suggestion than yours," said the Mole. "All you've done is—" The Badger looked sternly down at them. "Now just listen to me," he said. "If we're to be at all successful in this venture, we must remain cool, calm, and collected. Now gather round me." And so they gathered round the Badger, and he told them a secret plan. It was so secret that he spoke in a whisper. It was daring, it was outrageous, it was dangerous, and it was also very, very exciting. In the next episode of The Wind in the Willows, Badger and Mole, Toad and Ratty make preparations to put the secret plan into operation, knowing that they face tremendous odds and that the battle will be fierce and bloody. The Badger was telling his secret plan. He spoke in a whisper, and the animals gathered close around him. Toad was quivering with excitement. You see, secrets had an immense attraction for him because he could never keep one, and he loved the thrill of telling others. "There is," said the Badger.
an underground passage that leads from the river bank, quite near here, right into the middle of Toad Hall."
"Oh, nonsense, Badger," said the Toad. "You've been listening to some old yarn. I know every inch of the hall. There's nothing of the sort, I assure you."
"Now look here, young fellow," said the Badger with great severity. "Your father, who was a particular friend of mine, discovered that passage, which is hundreds of years old, and showed it to me, thinking that one day it might be useful. But he said you couldn't hold your tongue and asked me not to tell you, unless one day you were in sore trouble and really needed it."
"Oh, well," said Toad. "Perhaps I am a bit of a talker. My friends get round me. We sparkle, we tell witty stories, and somehow my tongue gets wagging. But go on, dear Badger. How's this passage of yours going to help us?"
"Well, I've found out a thing or two lately," continued the Badger. "I got Otter to disguise himself as a sweep and call at the hall asking for a job. He found out there's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe, and they'll be unarmed and suspecting nothing."
"But the sentinels will be posted as usual," remarked the Rat.
"Exactly," said the Badger. "That is my point. The Weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels, who won't see or hear us, for the passage leads right up under the butler's pantry, next to the dining room."
"We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry," cried the Mole. "With our pistols and swords and sticks," shouted the Rat.
"Rush in upon them," said the Badger.
"And whack 'em and whack 'em and whack 'em," cried the Toad, leaping into the air.
"Very well, then," said the Badger. "Our plan is settled. I suggest now that we all retire to bed. We can make all the necessary arrangements tomorrow morning."
The Toad slept to a very late hour next morning, and by the time he got down, he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast some time before. The Mole had slipped off somewhere by himself without telling anyone where he was going. The Badger sat in the armchair reading the paper and not concerning himself in the slightest about what was going to happen that very evening. The Rat, on the other hand, was running around the room, his arms full of weapons of every kind. He was piling them in 4 little heaps on the floor and saying excitedly under his breath as he ran, "Here's a sword for the Rat, here's a sword for the Mole, here's a sword for the Toad, here's a sword for the Badger. A pistol for the Rat, a pistol for Mole, a pistol for Toad, a pistol for Badger." And so on in a regular rhythmical way, while the 4 little heaps gradually grew and grew.
"That's all very well, Rat," said the Badger. "But just let us once get past the stoats with those detestable guns of theirs, and I assure you all we'll need is sticks. The 4 of us will clear the floor of them in 5 minutes."
"It's as well to be on the safe side," said the Rat, and he went on distributing the weapons. The Toad, having finished breakfast, was rehearsing for the night attack.
"I'll learn 'em to steal my house. I'll learn 'em," he cried.
"Don't say learn 'em, Toad," said the Rat. "It's not good English. It ought to be teach 'em, not learn 'em."
"We don't want to teach 'em," said the Badger. "We want to learn 'em good and hard, and what's more, we're going to."
Then the Mole came tumbling into the room, and very pleased with himself, too. "I've been having such fun," he said. "I've been annoying the stoats."
"I hope you've been careful, Mole,"
said the Rat anxiously. "Well, I got the idea early this morning," said the Mole. "I found that old washerwoman's dress in the kitchen, so I put it on and went off to Toad Hall as bold as you please. The sentries were on the lookout, of course, with their guns, and their 'Who goes there?' and all the rest of their nonsense. 'Good morning, gentlemen,' says I, very respectful. 'Want any washing done today?' And of course the sergeant told me to run away and not bother his troops. 'Run away,' says I. 'It won't be me that's running in a very short time from now. You see, my daughter washes for Mr. Badger, and what she told me you'll find out pretty soon. This very night, 100 bloodthirsty badgers, armed with rifles,
are going to attack Toad Hall by way of the paddock. 6 boatloads of rats with pistols and cutlasses will come up the river and effect a landing in the garden, while a picked body of toads, known as the Death or Glory Toads, will storm the orchard and carry everything before them, yelling for vengeance. And there won't be much left of any of you by the time they're through, unless you clear out now while you have a chance. And then I ran away and hid, and took a peep at them through the hedge. They were as nervous and as flustered as could be, running all ways and tripping over each other, everyone giving orders and no one listening. And then I heard them complaining about the weasels, and how they would be feasting in the banqueting hall, while they, the stoats, would be out in the cold and at the mercy of the bloodthirsty badgers.
"Oh, you silly ass, Mole!" cried Toad. "You've spoilt everything!"
"Mole," said the badger quietly, "I perceive you have more sense in your little finger than some other animals have in the whole of their fat bodies. You've done splendidly. I've great hopes of you, and you're a very clever little fellow." The toad was simply wild with jealousy, more especially as he couldn't make out for the life of him what the mole had done that was so particularly clever. But before he had time to show his temper or expose himself to Badger's sarcasm, the mole diplomatically led him outside and, seating him in a wicker chair, made him tell all his adventures since his first day in prison. The toad's jealousy quickly became a dizzy happiness. Someone had actually asked to hear the full story of his heroic deeds. And as you understand, I'm sure, they sat out there for a very long time. It was late that evening, and the rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, had summoned them all back into the parlor. The rat himself was ready for all the night should bring. Around his waist, a thick leather belt. Stuck into it, a sword on one side, a cutlass on the other. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, a flask, and a sandwich case. So he stood there, every inch a warrior, and made sure that his 3 friends equipped themselves similarly from the piles of weapons on the floor. When all was quite ready, the badger, with stick in one hand and lantern in the other, gave his instructions. "Now then, follow me. Mole first, because I'm very pleased with him. Rat next, and Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter as much as usual, or you'll be sent back as sure as fate." It was very dark along the riverbank, and up at the front, the badger was careful to point out to Mole any roots or holes that might make them trip. And the mole passed the information back to the rat, and the rat passed it back to Toad. But Toad was in a world of his own, and wasn't really listening, so it was inevitable. He tripped and fell into the water. 5 minutes later, after he'd been hauled out of the river, it was a very wet Toad who brought up the rear of the expedition. The badger led them into a clump of trees beside the bank, where he nosed around and then murmured, "Ah, yes, here we are," and lowered himself quietly into the entrance of the secret passage. The mole followed, then the rat, and last of all, Toad, who didn't find it quite as easy as the others. In the passage it was cold and dark. It was damp and low and narrow, and poor Toad began to shiver, partly because he was wet through, and partly in dread of what might be before him. The lantern was far ahead, and he was lagging behind when the rat called, "Come on, Toad!" And in fear of being left behind, he ran at such a pace to catch up that he collided with the others. Once the animals realized that it was only Toad and not an ambush by the ferrets, they continued. But only after Mole had pleaded with Badger not to send Toad back to the river bank. They'd been in the secret passage for some time when they heard far away, yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering, and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. The passage now began to slope upwards, and the noise grew louder and louder. "My, what a time those weasels are having," said the Badger. "Oh, but we'll learn 'em good and proper, won't we, Toad?" Those few words from the Badger really bucked up Toad's spirits, and he willingly lent a hand when the Badger said, "Ah, here's the trapdoor. Now, all together, heave!" And so together they pushed and they heaved and they heaved and they pushed, till the trapdoor was fully opened. And hoisting each other through, they found themselves standing in the pantry. The noise was quite deafening. Only a door stood between them and the enemy. "Are we all ready then?" said the Badger, and his friends nodded their agreement. The battle was about to commence. You have never heard such a noise in all your life as on that momentous night at Toad Hall. The banqueting room was absolutely packed with the wicked wild wooders. Long tables stretched down the entire length of the room, and the weasels sat at the tables and on the tables and under the tables. The minstrel gallery was packed to overflowing, and there were still more, hanging, holding, sitting where they could. You see, it was a very big occasion. They were celebrating the Chief Weasel's birthday, so he sat at the high table, surrounded by his deputies, feeling very pleased with himself. The Assistant Chief Weasel rose to his feet to announce the speeches.
"Hello, weasels and wild wooders! Silence for the Chief Weasel!"
And as those cheers rang out, Ratty, Mole, and Toad waited on the Badger's word.
"Wild Wooders, a word first about our kind host, Mr. Toad. Dear kind Toad, we all know Toad."
Hold hard a minute, said Badger. "Are we all ready?" "Right, the hour is come." The Badger flung the door open wide, and oh my, what a squealing and screeching filled the air as the four fearless friends went into battle. To the panic-stricken wild wooders, it seemed that the banqueting room was full of monstrous animals. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his cudgel whistling. The Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry, "A mole! A mole!" Rat, desperate and determined, armed with weapons of every age and variety. Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, and determined to get even with the Chief Weasel. The affair was soon over, and in the utter shambles of the banqueting room, the Badger stood back wiping his brow and surveyed the scene. Upturned tables and chairs, broken crockery, and a dozen or so dazed and battered weasels, on whom the mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. "Mole, old fellow," said the badger. "Oh, just cut along outside, will you, and look after those stout sentries, though I don't think we'll have much trouble from them tonight." And as Mole vanished through the window, the badger turned to Toad. "I want some grub, I do, Toad. So stir your stumps and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich." Toad was rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him. Still, he bustled about, as did the rat, and they laid out on one table some cold chicken and tongue that had hardly been touched, a plateful of lobster salad, and a whole basketful of French rolls with cheese, butter, and celery. Then the mole clambered back through the window, with a broad grin on his face, his arms full of rifles. "It's all over from what I can make out," he said. "As soon as the stoats heard the yells and shrieks from the hall, they downed their rifles and fled. So it's all quiet outside. I think I'll join you fellas for supper." The weasel prisoners looked on in awe as the 4 fearsome animals, still armed, did justice to the remains of the banquet. Badger, a mouthful of ham, a chicken egg in each paw, and a pile of lobster salad before him. Rat, trying to eat 2 rolls at once, each packed with an assortment of cheese, chicken, and lettuce. Mole, at least he used a fork, tucking into the most enormous mixture piled high on his plate. And, of course, Toad. He rose to his feet, then cleared his throat. "My friends," he said, you don't know how happy I am to be back at Toad Hall. But without your help, it would never have happened. So to you, Badger, Mole, and Ratty, thank you. Thank you indeed." 2 hours later, a very tired mole set free the weasel prisoners from the back door. They scampered across the garden, amazed that they'd been let off so lightly. Mole locked up the back door and made his way upstairs to bed, where Ratty, Badger, and Toad were already fast asleep and dreaming of the happy days that now lay ahead of them. The following morning, Toad came down to breakfast late as usual. The mole and the water rat were chatting on the lawn, and Badger was sitting in an armchair deep in the morning paper. "I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you, Toad," he said, without looking up from his paper. "You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. So I suggest that straight after breakfast you write out invitations to all our friends, and we'll have them delivered before luncheon." "What?" cried the Toad. "Me stop indoors and write letters on a jolly morning like this? Oh, yes, well, if you insist, dear Badger, then it shall be done. Now, you go and join our young friends in the garden. I shall sacrifice this fair morning on the altar of duty and friendship." The Badger eyed him very suspiciously, but said nothing, as Toad sat at the writing desk and straightway put pen to paper. And from what he wrote, it was obvious that the coming banquet was to be an all-Toad affair. It was noon, and Toad had finished all his letters and arranged for their delivery when the other animals came into the room. They marched up and stood defiantly before him. The rat spoke first. "Now look here, Toad," he said. "It's about this banquet. Let me tell you once and for all, there are to be no speeches and no songs. We know what you're up to. We stopped the messenger boy and read your invitations." "Mayn't I sing just one little song?" pleaded Toad piteously. "Not even one," said the Badger firmly. "You know that all your songs and speeches are conceit, boasting, and vanity." "Toad, it's for your own good," said the Mole. "Do you want to be the laughing-stock of the Stoats and Weasels?" Toad left the room with faltering footsteps, his handkerchief pressed to his eyes. "Badger," said the Rat, "I feel like a brute." I know," said the Badger, "but it had to be done. It had to be done." My, oh my, what a gathering there was that night at Toad Hall. From near and far came the animals to celebrate Toad's return. And when Toad made his entry down the sweeping staircase, a great cheer rang out from the assembled animals. They gathered round, congratulating him and saying nice things about his courage, his cleverness, and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Oh, not at all." And, "Oh, good heavens, no, it was Badger, Mole, and Rat who bore the brunt of the fighting." It was the same after dinner. From around the great banqueting room came a chorus of cries for Toad to make merry as in the old days. But Toad only shook his head gently and raised one paw in mild protest. But if the other animals were amazed at Toad's modesty, Badger, Ratty, and Mole were absolutely astounded. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this great climax, the four animals led their lives in happy contentment. Toad sent presents to the jailer's daughter and the engine driver. He even compensated the barge woman for the loss of her horse, though under severe compulsion from Badger. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll in the wild wood, now successfully tamed as far as they were concerned, and they'd be greeted respectfully by the inhabitants. And the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the door and say, "Look, there goes the great Mr. Toad and the gallant water rat. And that's the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you've so often heard your father speak." And they'd tell them that if they were not good, the terrible Badger would up and get them. Which, of course, was quite untrue. For Badger was really very fond of children, but it never failed to have its full effect. And that is the story of The Wind in the Willows. But I'm sure you'll all agree that it would be most unkind not to thank all those who made the story possible. Animals large and small, from near and far, and a few humans as well, who gave up so much of their time to take part. Especially we thank Mole, Ratty, Badger, and the one and only Mr. Toad. But above all, we are indebted to their creator, Kenneth Graham.